Good evening and welcome to the Royal Geographical Society. I think there's a great buzz in the air this evening, of course, for the subject of this evening's lecture and the wonderful exhibition. But I also think, frankly, if we'd asked you to come and watch a railway timetable being read out, there would be a similar buzz, simply because of the sheer joy at all being together as human beings again. I'm sure you agree. In a moment, I'm going to hand over to Dr Elisabeth Kendall, respected Arab specialist, who will soon take up the role of Mistress of Girton College, Cambridge. We are in great hands. I will mention that Mark Evans, who was going to be lecturing tonight, deeply regrets that due to a family emergency, his father-in-law is gravely ill. He could not attend tonight. He sends his apologies. I want to welcome Your Royal Highness, Your Excellencies, and all of you to the Royal Geographical Society tonight for what is a great example of what this institution is about. Cultural diplomacy, exchange, I think a wonderful use of the extraordinary archive we hold of material from all over the world. But we do a particularly good job of high cold places and a particularly good job of hot desert places. And we've done a wonderful job, I think, of gathering together with the team that have created this excellent show, a very inspiring piece of work for you to study. In welcoming you here, I'm going to supply you, just before I leave the stage, with a very useful bit of fact, if any of you are quiz compilers for Christmas parties and so on. You are sitting at Hot and Cold Corner. So in the London cabbies knowledge exam, where they have to demonstrate their intimate knowledge of every street in London, this is known as Hot and Cold Corner, and the reason is because on one corner we have Livingston, and on the other corner we have Shackleton. So as you leave, I leave you to go and enjoy the actually really impressive statues of those two. But the last thought to leave you with is, this is an active place today, advancing the mission from 1830 of advancing geographical science. That job today, I think, is about making a more sustainable world. And we have a responsibility to fulfill in that relation. And I think that actually that's not so far from the mind of many of the ambassadors, including His Royal Highness, as a part of our mission in the years to come. So in the vanishingly small possibility that you're not already members or fellows of the Royal Geographical Society, I warmly invite you to join us. Now, over to Elisabeth. Thank you.
Thank you. This might work. Let me just see if this works without, yes, I think it does, yeah. Well, how do we follow that? Thank you very much for that wonderful introduction. We're all absolutely thrilled to be here and to have the opportunity to talk about something so fascinating, so daring, so adventurous, and so close to our own hearts as exploring the deserts. Now, in case you haven't had the opportunity yet to see the exhibition, I should just mention that it's open until 10:30, I think, tonight, or at least 10 o'clock, so you'll have the chance after this panel. And if you do need to dash off, don't worry, it's going to be open until June the 8th, so there's no excuse. So why Shakespeare? I thought it was fascinating that this is called The Other Shakespeare, because, you know, I won't lie to you, he's not the first person that comes to mind when one talks about British explorers and Arabia. He's probably the most important desert explorer from Britain of whom we've never really heard. He has stiff competition, of course. There's T.E. Lawrence of Arabia, Bertram Thomas, someone whose work I've really enjoyed reading because my own heart lies in Yemen, Harold Ingrams and his wife, Doreen, who went with him on most of his adventures, St John Philby, who I believe we have his descendants, and including his granddaughter here this evening, so welcome to you. Wilfred Thesiger, needs no introduction. In fact, I believe you met him, right? Did you meet?
Yeah, we documented his recollections.
Shakespeare predates all of those glittering names. He was born in 1878 in India. He was schooled in Britain. He went to Sandhurst. He worked as a political agent in India and the Middle East. He was a soldier, a diplomat, an explorer, an amateur botanist. So why don't we know more about him until now? Unlike those other adventurers I just mentioned, Shakespeare didn't really leave any full-on conscious written account. He didn't write a book, he didn't publish a book about his adventures. And he died young. After World War I broke out, he went on this last return to Arabia, and in early 1915, he joined the forces of Abdulaziz ibn Saud in battle against his Ottoman-backed allies, and he died. And he was only 36 when he was killed. Now, I confess that a couple of decades ago, I'd have thought that was quite a good innings. But sitting where I do now, it seems incredibly young. He was cheated of life. But luckily, we have archives and letters, and of course, his wonderful photographs and maps that you can see out there. And we have an added advantage, which is that in Arabia, there's a very strong tradition of oral narrative and a really strong collective memory. And this is where we hope Dr. Fahd will also come in and help us. So this evening, we have two eminent historians who've pieced together Shakespeare's story through painstaking research. And maybe more importantly, they've got the knowledge and the deep expertise to be able to put it all in a much broader geopolitical context and really bring it to life. Perhaps they can also explain why and how this still matters for us today. So I'm now going to introduce our two speakers. Let me introduce first Dr. Fahd bin Abdul al-Semari, who is Secretary General of the King Abdulaziz Foundation for Research and Archives, better known as DARA. He's also a trustee of the King Fahd National Library. Dr. Fahd received his PhD from the University of California, Riverside, let's just say at a time when I was still tinkering around with my first essays. And he's played a crucial role in documenting the history of Saudi Arabia. Not only has he published many important articles and books, but he can also engage practically. Dr. Fahd is much respected for his work on preserving the Saudi heritage, but at the same time, thinking about ways of opening it up and introducing visitors to it so they can enjoy it and learn from it. He's very much in demand, so we're extremely lucky to have him this evening. Thank you, Dr. Fahd. And here we have Alan Dillon on my left, who, it's difficult to know how to describe Alan. He's a diplomat, a military man, a historian, an author. I mean, just the kind of all-rounder that kind of reminds me of Shakespeare himself. Alan began his career by joining the Royal Marines and spent more than a decade, traveling, undertaking operational tours, and even learning Arabic. He joined the Foreign and Commonwealth Office in 2000, so he spent the last 20 years serving in a variety of locations in the Middle East, South Asia, and of course, also Whitehall. And right now, he's posted in Oman, and he's traveled here specially to join us this evening. So we thank him for that. We're very lucky still to have diplomats with such a deep knowledge of the history of the region. I think this is really important, and in fact, it's something that comes through very strongly in the introduction to Alan's book. The introduction was written by Sir John Jenkins, former ambassador to Saudi Arabia. And that's definitely worth a read. Don't skip the foreword. Don't skip the foreword to the book. I think it's worth me giving Alan's book a bit of a plug here. It's fantastic. It's published by Medina Publishing, and it's called Captain Shakespear, Desert Exploration, Arabian Intrigue, and the Rise of Ibn Saud. I know it's only May, but there's no harm in doing your Christmas shopping a little bit early. And Alan is busy researching another book now on John Gordon Lorimer, who was a companion of Shakespeare's. And in fact, it was Lorimer who was behind the publication of the Gazetteer, a very important publication for the British Empire in terms of the production of knowledge on the Gulf. So, okay, we're certainly going to miss Mark Evans this evening and his very practical take on desert exploration, but we do have with us two very eminent historians who are going to take us through it. And if there are any questions related to modern day adventures, I'd be very happy to take them on myself if they come up in the questions. I think it's a good place to start by asking Alan about the context of British exploration in Arabia at the turn of the 20th century. What was going on? I think it's quite tempting to view these desert explorers as romantic individuals looking for adventure, but to what extent were they actually really engaged by the British government and politically motivated? So with that very gentle question, Alan.
Thank you very much.
Perhaps you'd step in.
Thank you, Royal Highness, the RGS for this evening. Yeah, the political motivation. I mean, it's a common view now that rather than the pursuit, the consumption of knowledge being an outcome on the British Empire, it's now an obligation, a duty, a condition of it. And when you look at the political agents like Shakespeare and others, it was almost a duty. If you look at the way that the government of India was set up, more so than Whitehall, with Arabia falling within its remit, you can sympathise with that. You can see how the government was set up to rationalise, to legitimise the concept of power through science and through mathematics. And you see this through various commissions, censuses, constant surveys, topographical, geological, endless special duties, political agents going away for 6 months, a year at a time to map, measure, and record. And it wasn't just a consumption of knowledge. It was in part a conspicuous consumption of knowledge, because in parts it was very, very overt, a very, very clear statement of intent and capability of the empire. Because a lot of these officials, if classification allowed, of course, could get their work published by the Government of India Press, and anyone could buy these works. Works on local dialect, on local customs, on laws. An endless wealth that was available publication. But that worked fine in sort of India. But when you look at the Arabian Peninsula, or they called Turkish Arabia at the time. At the start of the 20th century, it was estimated that 90% of the peninsula was unexplored. Oh. And by that, I mean unexplored by, Europeans and Orientalists. There were certainly, pockets of knowledge, of course, the Jeddah and the Hejaz, the holy sites, they were well known, they were well trodden. And the coastline itself, the extensive coastline from the Red Sea right up into the Gulf, that had been, charted and sketched by the Royal Navy and the Bombay Marine for over 100 years. So the hinterland was well known. And then you look to the north, the sort of biblical north, and the caravan routes that swept down to Jebel Shama, to Hale, and into Jeddah and to Kuwait. Again, they were well trodden, not just by Crown agents, but Bell, Lady Anne Blunt as well, another example of these sort of pioneers. But the interior itself, it was a void. The first Briton to actually get into the interior, to penetrate the interior, wasn't intentional. It was a young captain called George Sadler, who I think it was 1819, landed in Qatif, and then over a period of 5 or 6 months trekked across Arabia into the western coast. And it wasn't deliberate. He was on a mission to try and gain knowledge and to engage with the Ottoman. And anyone who's familiar with his diaries, I mean, this man suffered. It was attritional. But then we see nothing for 40-odd years. But then Louis Pelly, who was the political resident in Bashir, he travelled down in 1865. It was a very, very quick sojourn from Kuwait down the Baton Road into Riyadh, and then out again for Qatif. Just 2 weeks duration. I mean, he had 4 or 5 days with Sheikh Faisal al-Saud in Riyadh. And then beyond that, there was nothing. And, Pelly's motivation was twofold. Of course, he was on a tasking from the government to establish a relationship, to understand intent. But he was also partially motivated by the Royal Geographical Society, who'd actually set a question, who could get a latitude and longitude of Riyadh. It was an unknown. And the reason why they asked that question was because another explorer, Palgrave, had been in Riyadh a couple of years beforehand, and there were loads of doubts about his observations. There was uncertainty. And Pelly took it upon himself to try and correct them. And, in some parts he did, and some parts, actually, he challenged Palgrave's observations. But after the early 1860s, it isn't until George Curzon comes along at the tail end of the century, when he becomes viceroy in 1899, he has his own interest in the Gulf, and that is triggered by his tour through Persia a decade previously, when he wrote The Persia and the Persian Question. He dedicates a chapter to the Gulf. And in typical Curzon arrogance, it was his attempt to fill the many gaps in knowledge of this country which I've traveled through. Now, he stopped very briefly in Muscat and then sailed non-stop up to Fao. So he can hardly say that he tread the floor, but he dedicated a chapter to it. And then when he became, as I say, viceroy, and then did a grand tour in 1903, again, a sort of statement of the British Empire's intent. He stopped off again in Muscat, Sharjah, in Bahrain, and Bashir, and Banu Abbas, and Kuwait. At the same time, he commissioned a book of reference, which would ultimately be the Gazetteer. And the mission was, he wanted a book of reference that could answer any question on the geography, on the politics, on the history, and the relationship of the Gulf. And so that was the precursor, and that set people like John Gordon Lorimer off to establish a Gazetteer. Now, Lorimer himself toured a little bit around the Gulf, and he drew extensively from these publications. I mean, I think over 700 publications were referenced in the Gazetteer. But he also relied heavily on the political network, people like Shakespeare, the resident Cox and Knox, Gray, Prideaux, guys who were based in the region, and they were basically given a questionnaire to go out and gather as much information as they could. And so that was the political motivation for it all.
Thank you. I mean, I have to say that I'm blown away by your ability just to reel it off like that. And, but also by some of the phrases that you come up with, like filling gaps in their knowledge, etc. And I think this is a very good time to pull in Dr. Fahd for a Saudi perspective, because on the one hand, while we probably imagined that we were doing these fabulously original, exploratory, gap knowledge gap filling exercises. And perhaps history on our side imagines that we were exploiting Saudi Arabia. I can imagine, or what became Saudi Arabia, I can imagine that from the other side, there was a very gracious way of thinking, well, we let these people do what they want to get up to, and we'll see how we can profit from them in a very smart way. So I'd be very interested to hear your perspective, Dr. Fahd.
First of all, thank you, Your Highness, for giving me this opportunity to be contributing, if anything, of benefit. But it's my, honor to be here among you and Dr. Elisabeth and Alan. Definitely, we will not fill the position of Mark Evans because he's the major contributor here. But our hearts are with him and his family. I think, if you look at the exploration from the Saudi point of view, first of all, look at the scene at the time of the turn of the 20th century, 1910, 1908, 1909. You will notice that there was a personality, political figure, trying to position himself, trying to get the heritage of his family as the first Saudi state and second Saudi state within a political realm that was led by the British around Arabia, and try to contact these people. Along with that, in Kuwait, you have the Russians also coming and trying to contact the leaders of the rulers of the area. So definitely, when you look at the explorations, the explorers, when they come from the Saudi side, they are considered to be politicians. They are coming as envoys. They're coming to tell messages or explain some ideas and take point of view. If you look at that thing, then you will notice there is some peculiarity about the British exploration. The major peculiar thing about British exploration, it mixes two things. One is political and one is personal. And this is where we benefited as Saudis from the exploration of the British. Because of the political, that's usually done in one time, and each time it changes every time. But the personal things that we saw just a while ago in the exhibition, it is the treasure that we as Saudis are indebted too much and greatly to this treasure that helps us understand more about our history, more about architecture, more about lands and people. So the King Abdul Aziz, was clever enough and wise enough to meet these people and finishes with whatever they came for, and also extended to the personal to meet their personal interest for getting information about Saudi Arabia. And there is another also point about this, that at that time, the British government in India and in Foreign Office in London, they were in challenge of ideas. They did not want to go into the inner lands of Arabia. I think this idea, this position at the early period of time, was the major challenge for Shakespeare and others to come and understand more in order to push for their ideas. Had it been, they are said, okay, we are interested, you might have not been seen some of the ideas presented. I think a challenge is there in the exploration and in their writings. If you look at the writings themselves, I have read several accounts in England, in British, in German, French, Russian. I think the British writing is more authentic, in my opinion, to the extent where they get the information. Some errors inside there, that's something else. But what I'm trying to mention is they are describing every bit of information in our society. This is what counts today. And especially today, the photographs housed here in the collection, people look at them in the past as being something nice, something, gorgeous to see as a picture of individuals or a scenery. But now it's more different. It's more important than in the past. Because now new ideas coming, how to read photographs, how to read notes, how to understand the society, how to, to get the embedded ideas within these images to understand how life was. Not just only to complement the picture. And now it's you try to utilize the picture, to get more ideas about it. So this is where we are greatly indebted to Shakespeare, to Philby, to everybody who came to Saudi Arabia and wrote something about it other than the political side. The political side that has something changing, as I mentioned, and idea. One thing important as well, it is the same principles. of the Saudi government position from the early time in 1900s until today, where we keep our interests protected. In the meantime, we are open up for other people's interests as long as they do not get conflict with our interests. So this is where King Abdulaziz, when he met Shakespeare, and I might have a chance to talk about more some of the stories behind that, he looked at the person, when he met him, as two people. Political, finish, then finalize the discussion. What comes after is the social part that is very, very treasures for us and is very important for us. And that's where we are still. We need to look more to the pictures nowadays. We need to more to the notes as well. We need to read more about how they saw the people and how they react to the people. And also tells us another story. It is the openness of the society at that time. And it tells us that what is being written by Shakespeare and others, from their point of view on hand, first hand, not distorted. You read from Shakespeare himself. You don't read from people who try to give you another issue, another image. Because the problem with nowadays media is changing, distorting the image. But if you go to the original writings, you find, whether we agree or disagree, this is something else. But at least you find the authenticity of things that we wanted to come back to the picture, where we understand Saudi Arabia and Britain more. And I think that's the beginning. When King Abdulaziz met Shakespeare, they were at the same age. King Abdulaziz was born in 1877. Shakespeare was born in 1878. So they were at the same age. So their interaction was fabulous. And that we might have a chance to shed some light on that.
Oh, thank you. I'm really fascinated to hear so much that's of relevance today being brought into that analysis, things like fake news, citizen journalism, and also just the openness of the monarch to welcome and value those who are coming to seek to impart knowledge to their homelands about his kingdom. Because apart from the authentic nature that you mentioned, actually it's a really good way of controlling the narrative, right? I think it was a rather smart move on King Abdulaziz's part. But this whole idea about a more holistic and very authentic approach on the part of British explorers, British writings, I'd like to ask Alan a bit more about this personal motivation of Shakespeare and others. I was intrigued to read in your book, Alan, about the day that Shakespeare was killed and how that happened, and that very shortly before, he'd written a letter to his brother saying, I think everything's going to be okay, I think it's going to be safe, or he says, I don't think it will be unsafe, really, don't worry, and then he was killed. And it struck me that in today's world of filling in risk assessment forms and everything that goes with bureaucracy and government and academic fieldwork exercises, that this was so unusual. What was it that motivated these people personally?
Yeah. I mean, I know it sounds glib, but Shakespeare really was a product of that generation, of the empire. He wasn't unique. I mean, he was an ordinary person doing, an extraordinary thing. I mean, he wasn't alone. I mean, there were lots of people like him. Let's mention there, Shackleton and Livingston. There's a fine bloodline there. But I mean, not everyone was motivated. I mean, I go back to the point about the gazetteering and mobilising the political agency network to gather information about the peninsula as a whole. And there were some who just weren't up for it. Some were quite old, some had ill health, some had family commitments, big families they just didn't want to be apart from. And the security in some of these places were obviously of concern to some. I mean, less so Shakespeare. I mean, there was certainly no financial motivation. If you were lucky, you might have got a little bit of financial backing from the society here. And professional recognition maybe through an award. But what motivated Shakespeare, I guess, and many like him, was sort of provenance and primacy. The first, to be the primary source of something new, to own that information. And in many ways, I mean, he found himself in competition a bit of brinksmanship with another British official, a guy called Leachman, who was actually employed by the War Office to do much the same thing as Shakespeare. But they had very, very different approaches. I mean, Shakespeare, I'll come back to Shakespeare actually. Leachman moved at speed. He was in disguise. He would travel with an interpreter. His linguistic skills weren't as good as Shakespeare. And he'd just disappear for a month and then come out somewhere and didn't take many notes. Shakespeare was methodical. I mean, you see that in his notes here. I mean, you know, he wanted to be the first to go somewhere, to see someone, to take a photograph of something, which ultimately led to his death. You know, he didn't need to do that. And his very death was because he wanted to get one up on Leachman. Leachman had been involved in a tribal gazoo, a sort of a clash between some men loyal to Abdul ibn Saud against the Shama tribe, and had written about it. Shakespeare wanted the photograph and chose Jirab as the place to take that photograph. Now, we don't know whether he took it, but ultimately that's what led to his death. His own, you know, the motivation was to get one up on Leachman. I don't suppose it was particularly deliberate. But what drove many of them was the one to be the source of this knowledge.
I can believe that. Thank you very much for those insights. Now, I wonder, just before we open to the floor, whether Dr. Fahd, you did say that you had some insights, some thoughts on the kind of reception that King Abdulaziz gave to such British envoys, the style in which he dealt with them and how close they were. But also I wondered if you could add to that how important local people were, not the king, but just ordinary local people were to the enterprise of explorers.
Okay. First of all, King Abdulaziz, when he met Shakespeare and met, you know, some of the, he always looked at the person from the two sides. One side is the mission, and the other side is the person himself, personality. So the mission, he could meet anybody, then he would check the person if he has that personality that he will deal with or not. Because some political, you know, envoys, they would just come and deliver the message and they go. They don't, you know, express any personality that to be dealt with in the long run. So Shakespeare, from the beginning, King Abdulaziz felt that he is an aristocrat. He's coming from a British family that has heritage and has traditions. So he began to open up with him in the discussions. And in the meantime, King Abdulaziz used that style of having the social discussions with the guests, especially Shakespeare. He also utilized some questions to get something in his mind that the other side doesn't know what he exactly wants. So when he met him in 1912, and he began to talk about the political thing, and he finished the political and said, Shakespeare, now we are done with politics. Let's have coffee. Let's have, you know, more of talk things about, you know, our life and so on. So he was happy, Shakespeare, because he wants to know, he wants that side. He's, you know, pursuing that personal side, not the political side to some extent, or at least, you know, to be equal. So he asked him a question. He said, Shakespeare, what are you doing in the world now? What's the British are doing in the world? Forget about Arabia. Then Shakespeare, because he felt that he's part of this family, and the way that King Abdulaziz is talking to him, he began to express some of information or disclose some information that is, he doesn't know that it's of benefit to him, to King Abdulaziz or not. So he said, now the British are working with the Ottomans to sign an agreement. So he changed the subject with some social thing and some tradition about the coffee and the coffee making and all these things and the tradition of the tribes and so on, which felt, you know, more into, his interest to be felt in that time. After the meeting, King Abdulaziz immediately informed his father and said, Al-Hassa. Al-Hassa is in the eastern province. And we are indeed indebted to Shakespeare
because the King Abdulaziz, before that, he tried in 1910 to convince Shakespeare for the British to allow him to go to Al-Hassa, because the Ottomans there, if you need some support, please send me some weapons. And they did not care. They said, we cannot interfere in the inner Arabia, 1. 2, we cannot interfere with something against the Ottomans. So we cannot do that. So King Abdulaziz felt that they cannot do any help for that portion of his kingdom to be restored, which is Al-Hassa. So when he learned that the British are working on a treaty with the Ottomans, immediately he understood that Al-Hassa will be part of the agreement. It's going to be difficult to take it even from the British. So what he did, he told his father, secretly, he began to organize a campaign to take Al-Hassa. They were gathering, suddenly a British man came, Leachman, came to Arabia and said to him, I'm here to go to Rub al-Khali, to empty quarter. But what are these people gathering for? King said to him, we are gathered to go to a campaign up the north, but now we are finishing and we're coming back to Riyadh. Come back to Riyadh. So he invited him and he get him all the things he needed. And he, even with Leachman, he tried to apologize for him that in the palace inside in the middle town of the Riyadh, he said to him, forgive us, Leachman, because this palace, I'm still, few years, coming to power and try to get myself, and it's not as supposed to be for you. But he slept that night in Riyadh. Then he said, I cannot help you to go to empty quarter. So if you go back to Kuwait or you go back to Oman, it will be easier. Until he felt that Leachman left the area, then he came and took Al-Hassa again. Suddenly, Shakespeare was asked by the government, what happened? How King Abdulaziz took Al-Hassa immediately, and he was asking you for help, and we did not offer him any help. Did you tell him anything about this? He said, he asked me a question, I answered it. So this is something that we understand from the way that you benefit from the other side, as long as it is for your benefit, and it's not against your interest, because the British were not even maybe thinking of Al-Hassa, but the agreement with the Ottomans was something for the First World War, as you mentioned, at the threshold of the 1914, and then they needed some, more of power, re-staging things before that war started. So I think it's the way that he dealt with Shakespeare. He dealt with Philby. Philby in 1917, when he came for a mission, he asked to go to southern of Najd. King Abdulaziz took him 3 days, 4 days or more to say, no, don't go. Don't go. Because if you go to the south and you are a British man, then they would be, acting against you. I'm afraid for your security. So he felt, he stressed, more and more until the king said, okay, go ahead. Same thing with Shakespeare. He tried several times before they marched to the battlefield and asked him, can I go with you? He said, no way. You stay in Al-Qasim, nearby Riyadh, about 300 kilometers, or you stay in a nearby town until we're done. Then we'll come and complete our discussions. He said, no. How Shakespeare convinced King Abdulaziz? He gave him a sentence, which I question if it's correct or not. He said to him, I am asked to be with you wherever you are, so I cannot, break that promise from the government. So he said, if this is the order of the government, I can. But there is something. We have to have a piece of paper. You write that it is your personal decision and it's not me. So you have to write that down. So he wrote in what, unfortunately we did not see it, but that was from the oral tradition, that was just to make sure if something happened to him, then we have a proof that we tried to convince him, because there wasn't that much of documenting other than writing a paper. This is maybe, if we come to his death, maybe we could elaborate more, or I could do it now.
I think you should do it right
away.
Yeah.
So the issue, there are so many stories about how he died. And some story they said, well, it's the people of King Abdulaziz who killed him because the British. This is nonsense, because he was with them several months and from 1910 he was coming to Riyadh, to Kuwait and Riyadh later, and nothing happened to him. What happened is that the personal interest in Shakespeare to document every bit of the event felt that he is now detaching himself from any insecure situation to his interest mainly. So he began to shoot, some photographs, and with his, hats, where he was distinguished easily. So he was hit from the back from the army because he was turning to the King Abdulaziz's area. After his death, usually his materials were with King Abdulaziz. King Abdulaziz wrote a letter of passion, the strongest letter of passion, with somebody who had been known with him for several years, not only a few days or a few months, because he considered that as a great loss. And even he told cooks, please send somebody from your side who speaks Arabic in order to see what happened exactly, because I was trying to prevent him not from coming. Because the King Abdulaziz wanted to show that to the British that he's a friend. He did not want him to come to this area. But that was his choice, and I couldn't do anything about it. So it was a great loss. All the materials, some of the photographs, which we see today, because they were packed and sent to Kuwait, and then he was buried in Kuwait. I think the story from the traditions that we collected from some of the oral history, the king was upset at that day, unbelievably, because it wasn't only politics or was the British were going to do about this, because this is something happened everywhere. I think it was more about a person King Abdulaziz saw in him, that he understood his position, he understood his people, he understood his land. So he would be a very good lawyer for him with the British government. Losing him was a great loss, actually.
Thank you so much. That's a wonderful perspective. Something that we so value, having the Saudi perspective and the oral narrative entwined. I wonder if we shouldn't use the last 12 minutes to get some questions from the floor, if you have any. Would you like to ask our experts anything? If you don't, we'll just carry on. But I can see a gentleman. Oh, I can see quite a few hands up. Yes, how about yes, you there. That's right. Yeah.
At the Francis Outram, University of Exeter and British Library, thank you very much to our speakers and our chair for fascinating presentations and commentary. I'd just like to give a very quick plug in that we have a project at the British Library which is digitising India Office records relating to the Gulf, and we do have, for example, articles written, one by my colleague Daniel Lowe, who's our Arabic specialist curator, who wrote something on the death of Captain Shakespear. Also on Gordon Lorimer. Now, my question is, if I may, slightly broaden out the discussion, which has gone on to Sinj and Philby, and in a sense, Saudi-British relations. And one of the themes, it seems to me, from Tony's presentation has been also, and this is not meant to in any way, sort of like we talked about the Foreign Office and the role of going from the Middle East and to London. One of the stories carried in our documents, which is around this period, is the end of World War I, actually going on to the Great Depression, is, and I don't mean to say this to embarrass the Foreign Office, and I'm sure Tony would find this possibly quite amusing, but at the time, the Saudis actually, and Ibn Saud, were actually quite keen to form, or would actually like to link up with the British. And I've got an article here, actually, I just checked on my phone, by a journalist called Matthew Teller, who came and looked at some of our archives. And one of his pieces was the diplomat that said no to oil. And this is slightly later, but it was someone called Oliphant. It was Sir Lawrence Oliphant. And unfortunately, the advisor to Ibn Saud, Hamza Fawad Bey, they said, Ibn Saud would like to really deal with the British, but at the time, this was just as the Great Depression had hit, and the civil servant said, actually, we're rather cash-strapped at the moment, and said no we can't help you. And so Ibn Saud created more of an alliance, an agreement with an American oil company, and 2 weeks later, after he had gone back from what was then Croydon Airport to Saudi Arabia, the largest oil sort of struck in history. So just to wrap up, I think...
Could I ask you to summarise your
Yes,
question?
to summarise, is there, in some ways, part of our theme this evening is about, we talked about the British as the great explorers. There was a role, in both political and personal, but in some ways, wasn't the British relationship with Saudi at that period one of the greatest failures of British diplomacy?
For the British?
For the British. Okay, that's quite a wide-ranging question, but
It really is, isn't it? Yeah.
But in a sense, I'm interested, so it reflects on the role of Foreign Office. It's this period, but I just thought, slightly as our theme is, the great British explorers.
We've got it.
Yeah.
Is it?
How would you summarize it?
I think the question is, to what extent were British agents actually responsible for what ultimately was a British failure? Does that sum it up? Yeah.
Well, I think, political decisions and political directions usually run by the circumstances at that time. And definitely in the past, we have strong relations. And until today, actually, you see, when Philby came in, he was also solidifying more with the government. Then we came into the visit of Lord of Athlone to Riyadh at that time in the 1930s from the British royal family. Then we came to the meeting between King Abdulaziz and Churchill. So the relationship is progressing, strong relations until today, actually. But usually at the beginning of it, in the early 20th century, there was the two schools in England, in English politics. One school is to stay away from inner side of Arabia, and the other school is why not to enter in and try to help and solidify our interests. So I think they were able, the explorers, to change that into the direction where the Britain would come into inner Arabia. So I think that was success for them. And this is where King Abdulaziz, felt too much, great loss of Shakespeare, not just because he was a good friend and he, liked his, relationship, but also because he was one of these pillars will change the way within the British politics.
I see your hand. There was another question over here earlier, but let's, since you've got a very...
Thank you. My question is just back to British exploration. My name's John Edwards, and I've written a book and a map called Wilderness Trekking Oman. And I did some research for the preface of that book about the history of the mountains. And one of the things I realized was a large number of the British explorers, Wellstead was one of the early ones, 1830s, what his prime motivation seemed to be basically bragging rights, to get his name back in Fleet Street about what he'd done, being the first Brit to go here and there. And so I thought I would sort of tweak the history a bit by doing some research in Lisbon in Portugal, and found out that in fact the Portuguese had reached the highest point in the Sultan of Oman 100 years before Wellstead, the British did. And that was kind of like a little piece of my book, mainly dealing with the 16-day traverse of the mountains. But my point is that was one motivation that hasn't been really set. It was just basically bragging rights, just to get their name in the press, even if it wasn't necessarily true. Thank you.
Well, thank you for that. I mean, I think you actually mentioned bragging rights, really, not in so much. But by the way, luckily we are talking about British explorers today, because if we made it completely international, we might not be patting ourselves on the back quite so much. Alan, bragging rights.
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, if you look at the Gulf, the Portuguese were there, a good 100 years before the British.
Austrians.
Yeah, not low. But of course, if they didn't record it, if they didn't write it, or if it wasn't actually swept up by Lama and his gazetteer, then it didn't happen, right? So the British can make claims to that. But you're absolutely right. And it really was one-upmanship. I'm going back to the gazetteer again, which obviously is the collation of every single bit of writing and reporting of travel at that time. I mean, Larimer, I think Larimer draws some excess of 700 pieces of work, and the vast majority of them are British. Then there's a few French, and there's a few German, sort of Austrian, and I think there's less than a dozen sort of Arabic from Arabian travellers. It's almost as if they were discounted because it wasn't British. It really didn't matter. But yeah, you're absolutely right. This was the empire, planting a flag.
Also, if I may, other than just the pictures, I think the British peculiarity of their involvement in Arabia, as I mentioned in my earlier speech, that you have the two sides, the political and the personal. I think the personal, led to so many writings and so many accounts and so many pictures and so many maps, which are very, very rich material, very deep, and we consider the British sources to be the #1 sources on the region. And regardless of any ideas, or any opinions, because that's usually the case, when you have your opinion, you put your opinion, then I will disagree or agree. But if you talk about the Gazetteer of Arabia, which was done for a political reason at that time, in order for the British to understand the area, to understand who is in this place and who's in that, what is this place, who inhabited this place. This is, at that time, it served its purpose. Then after that, nobody looked at it. Mm-hmm. When we came back to it and we translated to Arabic, we found wealthy information that nobody can today find it in any way. So we took that and translated to Arabic. Then we put in the footnote, if anything to be corrected, we'll put it in the footnote, that's our right, but also to complement the work. Because sometimes it's not mistake or errors, sometimes it's missing information. Like if they're talking about a tribe, then the branches of the tribe, so they miss 1 or 2 or 3, so we add them to the footnotes for people to get the picture. So I think this is a great contribution from our side, regardless of its political, framework or political purposes. Because this is, in the Arab world, if you look at the image of the British agents or envoys or explorers, usually they would call them as intelligence. They are, conspirator. This is nonsense, in my opinion, because these people come in to serve their purposes, and they come to discuss and have their opinion or opinion of their government. But we are talking about scientifically about what is the remnants of their contribution. It's information. Now we have to go back to it, study it, elaborate on it, comment on it, reject it or uphold it, or whatever that anybody with his own or her own research methodology. So I think we have tremendous treasure from the British side that we, as students of history, we have to learn from and to get more ideas. Now, if you look at Philby's work, so many people have read Philby's, so many books. He's the one who had produced so many books about Saudi Arabia. Some people read them as something of passion or a story. But if you go back to them, now Saudi Arabia, there is a new trend. They are reading them back in order to understand their society more, to understand who was there and what happened at that time, how he described this area, how he looked at this area. So there is a trend of getting back into this content and try to understand more. This is, I think, it's a living. So the British contribution, in my opinion, is a living content, living information, treasure that's still and will be in the future as well.
Well, I think that's I'm aware there are a couple more questions, and I'm very sorry. I hope we get the opportunity to speak afterwards, but I can see it's just gone 9 o'clock and I know people will have to leave. But this is a really nice note to leave it on. What does it mean for the future? How can we see this forging ahead? And I think the one regret I have is not answering the question, was Shakespeare known as Sheikh Zubair in the same way that Shakespeare, the Elizabethan playwright, was famously in a speech by Colonel Gaddafi of Libya, claimed for the Arabs. But there's so much more that we could discuss, but perhaps we can persuade the RGS to do another session sometime. Thank you to both of our speakers, and thank you all for coming along and listening and looking at the exhibition. It's still open, so perhaps we'll see you floating around. Please join me in thanking our speakers.
before everyone leaves, if you would just give me 1 minute, I've been inspired just to say a very short word. I'm the Saudi ambassador, in case those of you here don't know who I am. And we at the embassy were involved with the RGS in setting this up. First of all, I'd like to thank you all for coming. Shakespeare is a particular passion of mine. This one, not the other one. Well, the other one's pretty cool. I want to thank our panelists here. They've done a phenomenal job. It's an honor to listen to them all speak and to elaborate on really an extraordinary character. But the end of that really highlighted something for me, and what my job is here in the UK is to bridge the gap between different worlds. And I think the personal friendships that not just Shakespeare made in the region, but Philby and others, going back through the long history, not just of British explorers, but otherwise, is phenomenal. And if they were doing it back then, we should be doing it now. And that's not just between Saudi Arabia and Britain, but the regions of the world. And I think the world we're living in now is not short of problems. So this is really inspiring for me. I love the guy. I think he's pretty cool. And I would urge you all to read Alan's book. It's fantastic as well. It's another plug. And there'll be more books coming on these guys. And hopefully in the near future, more of these events to highlight some of the unique British explorers in Arabia, not just the men, by the way. So we're working on some of the ladies who spent a lot of time in Arabia in the old days that nobody believes actually happened. So thank you all once again. Thank you to the panelists. That was really phenomenal. And I'd like to thank the RGS for helping us put this on, and everyone who was involved, the staff at the embassy who've done an amazing job. And Anne, wherever you are, thank you very much. Thank you all for coming, and please enjoy the exhibition. There's some really cool pictures to look at. Thank you.